get uploaded within few days of this meeting to our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube, just search for DBA-VUG, you'll see that. Please subscribe, and you'll be able to replay this session and many of our older session for last 4 years. These are some of the future meetings. You can go and check in our meetup page. The more important is we are doing a 6-part series. That's why I did not take out my name from here, just so people get it. This will continue till May. So today is the second session of this series, and then we have 4 more. The goal of this is to get you ready to become a cloud DBA from an on-premises DBA. PaaS Summit is back. 2024 will be November 4th in Seattle in person. The registration is open. The call for speaker is also open, which is going to close on April 10th. And so check it out. This is the lowest price you will get. I think the price is going to increase sometime in the beginning of May. And with that, oh, sorry, I think I missed one slide. Sorry, there are some other sessions that are coming up. These are all over the country and overseas. Most of these are a full day free training. They're called SQL Saturday or Data Saturday. And there are some conferences also. So if you go to these websites I have here listed, you can see more details about these conferences. And with that, thank you, Erin, for coming, taking your time off from your work. Erin is going to talk about cloud networking basics for the DBA, so I'm not going to waste any more time. I'll hand over to Erin. I'll stop sharing. If you have any questions, comments for Erin or just for the organizers, put it in the chat. Erin has breaks built into the presentation. I'll read back those questions to Erin and for answering because you cannot unmute yourself. So I'm watching it, put it there, and Erin, back to you. I can see your slide.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for having me. I'm glad to be here today. I am Erin Dempster, and we're going to be talking about cloud networking basics. I am the data operations team lead for Creon Corporation. We're a small insurance company in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. As with most small companies, I wear a number of hats in the IT department. As a database administrator, I'm also the one of the Azure administrators, and I'm also the Azure DevOps administrator. With my experience, I've had a number of certifications over the years, including the Azure Architect Expert. I let it lapse last year. I need to go back and get that renewed. Here is some of my contact information, finding me on different platforms. So we want to move to the cloud. Everybody's talking about it. It's easy, right? We're just gonna take our databases and lift them to the cloud. It doesn't get much easier, right? Well, of course, that's not really true. So we are going to talk about what it really does. If you fully move to the cloud, this may be a dry, slow presentation. So this is really targeting those who are not yet in the cloud or those who are just starting to move their SQL resources to Azure or to the cloud. So today I have a few items we'll talk about. I'm going to start with the network planning and a refresher of corporate networks. Sometimes database professionals, we can get to our SQL server, but we don't always know what's going on behind the scenes. So I'll peel away at the layer a little bit and talk about it, which is going to help us roll into setting up the cloud environment. And we'll look at Azure specifically, but a lot of what we'll talk about could also be applied to AWS and other cloud providers. Once we have a cloud environment set up or partially set up, we do want to talk about how to secure that virtual network. And so we'll do that with network security group rules. Once we do that security, then we might run into some connectivity issues. So we'll talk about what some of the common ones are. And then finally, we'll look at authentication for Azure SQL products before we wrap up. So let's do a review of an on-premise network, corporate network. So Acme Corporation, it's a one building office. Real simple. It's the user space is in the building, and we've got a server room. So we have a network. Sorry, we've got a network segment for computers that users are using, and we have a segment for the server room. And of course, we've got that outbound connection to the internet through our core router. So when we look at adding a second office, because lots of companies will grow, the infrastructure team, hopefully you have one, or you've hired an MSP that can do the net infrastructure. They're going to come in or look at this and say, what network equipment do we need for a second office? What network resources are needed? So are there going to be servers in the second office that are needed, or what does the second office need from the primary building? And as part of that, which ports, what IP ranges, all that good stuff, what should be allowed. Once we've gone through that planning, then there's the setup of the applications and devices. From there, the infrastructure team will configure a firewall and send that to the remote office or deliver it, get it set up, define an IP address range for the remote office, and establish that VPN connection, site-to-site VPN connection, to bring that second office online as part of the corporate network. So then we end up with this second location. So that's really what's happening at a high level. And going to the cloud, it's really no different. It's like adding another location. So let's take a look at Azure specifically. So trying to be funny again, there's the Azure cloud, and we're a spec within it. But what do we have in our cloud account? So for Azure, we have our account that kind of encapsulates us logically from other businesses, other resources that are also using Azure. We can go and define services that are at an account level, and likely or by default, they'll be accessible to the internet. We'll talk about that. So we could be looking at a managed instance or some Azure SQL DBs. There's also, of course, SQL VM. So this is a regular Azure VM that's running a version of SQL Server for us. In our account, we're also going to need Entra ID and likely an Active Directory domain controller. So we've got a couple more resources. Those two talk to each other. So we kind of have this built out of the basics that we need. Or at least what we're going to talk about for the rest of this hour. So once we know kind of what's in our account, we still need to come back and integrate it with our existing network. So Acme is expanding to Azure, and somehow we do need to join the two so that Azure can talk to our physical location, and the physical location can communicate with the Azure account or with AWS or Google. How are we going to do this? Well, as a DBA or a database professional, it's probably not going to be you that needs to do this. So it's really your infrastructure team. How are they going to do this? So again, we need to do some planning and think about the network traffic. Is this going to be purely an extension to on-premises? That we've got a server room in the building and we want to put it into Azure for DR purposes or high availability, but it's really private to the business? Or will there be some sort of public access to those resources? Um, so if we're going to do a purely an extension to on-premises, we're going to want some way to connect our networks. So that could be Azure Virtual Network Gateway. That's the common way to do that. It runs over the internet and provides that site-to-site connection. Alternatively, there's ExpressRoute. It provides a very low latency connection to Azure, but it does require a lot of setup. It's you need to connect with a specific provider to do that in your area. And if you're not in a major metropolitan area, that might not be feasible. But I'd say 90% of the time, 90% of the cases, a virtual network gateway is sufficient to connect the businesses, or sorry, connect the networks. If there's going to be public access to Azure resources, then there are, besides using an Azure virtual gateway, or kind of a grouping of public IPs, you could have a vendor's virtualized gateway. So for internet, Cisco are a couple examples where you can have that load balancer or the firewall to provide access to specific resources. So it'll act a lot like an on-premises network, just it's virtualized. Are there any, before I jump into kind of Azure's offerings as examples of SQL options, are there any questions on kind of
No
getting
questions
the
yet.
network set up?
No, there are no questions, Erin.
Okay, perfect. I will move on to what is possible in Azure. So yeah, we have our landscape. We talked about some of these a bit. With managed instance, I had set them up and just as laid them out in our account. But now we can also create, one of the first things we need to do, excuse me, is to create a virtual network within our Azure account. That's going to give us the subnets and the IP capabilities to connect everything to our network. So I've gone ahead and drawn this out. So as part of that connection, one of the net subnets we would need is a VPN gateway. That's part of our network, and we'll use that then to connect back to our on-premises network. So that's the connection, that piece there. So let's jump in and talk about the Azure landscape. And I moved some slides around and kind of lost my order there. So we're getting back on track here. So again, we have our Azure account, and the first thing we're going to do again is set up a virtual network. And on there, we do need to have a subnet. So I picked one that's valid for this range. And we're going to bring in a couple of VMs. We have some VMs where we know we need to migrate from on-prem, and we're going to keep them as VMs. Again, when with those VMs, I need to have a domain controller. Good to have one in Azure to reduce traffic going across the VPN connection, keep it speedy. We might also decide that some of the databases we have can be migrated to Azure SQL DB. We'll use a couple of them as examples. And then Azure also offers us a managed instance. A managed instance is somewhat synonymous with AWS RDS instance, more or less. So those are really the three main offerings in Azure. So let's go and talk about a managed instance first and what that entails. This is going to be the hardest one to set up. It's not hard. It's the most complicated to set up. It requires what's called a delegated subnet. So I had that 172.16.18.0 subnet for everything else. I need to have something that only managed instance is going to use. That's because managed instances are really a black box or fully Azure managed resources. So we'll show in a minute, but they're going to give us an endpoint, and they do a whole bunch of craziness in the background. That does require a subnet with 32 IP addresses. It could be larger if you're going to have more instances, but you will. The documentation does say that each managed instance needs 16 IP addresses, so it can do various things. And again, it'll give us a private endpoint using our traditional port 1433. With managed instance, a public IP address is available, and traffic will flow in on port 3342. And when I say public IP address, I mean it's not public to just our Azure virtual network. It is public to the internet. So if I turn this on, I can have traffic coming in from the internet. I do need to set up some firewall rules, and we'll talk about that later. But I've been asked before what a public IP address means, and I really is straight out to the internet. So I talked about needing a whole bunch of IP addresses. All of this is what's happening in the background. I found this on Microsoft Learn a while back and found it interesting. So they give us a local endpoint that could also be the public IP, also go out to our public IP address. From there, there's a load balancer, there are gateways, one or more virtual clusters, some primary nodes, secondary nodes. Maybe the secondary nodes are available to us, maybe not, depends on the SKU we're using. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on. And again, this is black box. All we get to see is that local endpoint, which I'm somewhat thankful for. I do use Azure SQL Managed Instance at Treon. Our workload is such that it does work for us. And I'm thankful that I don't need to worry about any of this. I just need to worry about that connection to the local endpoint. So that's a managed instance. And we'll stick that on to our delegated subnet. So next, we'll talk about Azure SQL DB. And by default, this is internet facing, or there's a public IP address assigned to it during the setup. Of course, Microsoft gives us the ability to configure firewall rules. We can say this IP range has access to the public IP on the public IP, or we can set rules that say I'm only going to allow traffic from our internal network through the private link that's available. So that'll gives you flexibility to say, well, I'm going to turn off that public IP address, and we'll use the private link, and we'll explicitly define firewall rules to say just use our 172.16.18 subnet or our internal subnet. So we'll add that private link, and now we have our kind of our landscape set. And maybe I have that other SQL, Azure SQL DB. That one has some relatively public, or it's not confidential data. So I feel comfortable with the public IP address. It is also, these are PaaS services, platform as a service. So there isn't a VM per se behind them. There's a stripped down OS. It's like a Docker container. So they manage this pretty well. So if I do have that public IP address, there isn't really a route for me to go through this instance back into the internal network. It's fairly safe in that regards. It's just a matter of what type of data am I storing in that SQL DB that I want it to be public for one or more reasons. And then I didn't really talk about it because it's not a SQL offering, but a lot of times you're going to want blob storage, and we will need it for managed instances. We'll to store backups if you want to do out of band backups, or save logs to file shares. You'll want blob storage. Are there questions about the product offering in Azure and what kind of is needed for these?
Well, I mean, there is a comment from Paresh. Paresh says this too looks like a black box. And then Wayne asked a question, what are considerations for traffic and connecting Azure VMs to communicate / the MI? So I think Wayne's question is, what are the considerations for traffic and connecting Azure VMs to communicate with the managed instance?
Sure. So our managed, yep, I didn't draw a line here. So delegated subnet is in our virtual network along with the main subnet. So they can talk to each other by default. So it's internally, this would be considered internal or private communication. So it'd be connecting just for, as you would to another SQL instance. And for replication between the VMs, that'll work well. Replication between managed instance and VMs. I am drawing a blank out on at the moment for that. And the VM back to on-site. So that is, again, part of our local network. So that would just be going back over the VPN. Great questions, Wayne. So let's go into, now that we have the landscape. Oh, so I'm also looking at the chat. So there is I do see the question about network throughput. Within Azure, it's multi-terabit communications on their backbone. The limitation for an on-site is on-site is the speed of your VPN connection. So you can go from 125 meg up to several gigabits, and depending on what your main internet connection out of your physical location is. And my Entra ID icon. Yes, this is the rename of Azure Active Directory. So this is our identity management. So we'll go into some security. The biggest thing, if you're in Azure or AWS, are network security groups. These are your firewall rules for the cloud. So this is allowing or restricting network communications. You can have inbound and outbound rules, and there can be scoped for an instance, SQL managed instance, for example, or you can have a network security group set to network adapters on a VM or several VMs if you need to manage things at that level, or at the subnet of your virtual network. So I can say, this is my SQL subnet, and I'm only going to allow in Active Directory traffic, remote desktop, and SQL Server traffic goes in and out. And that's about all I want to allow on that subnet as an example. So security groups, as with any firewall, they have a lot of power and can help a lot, but they can also gum things up pretty quick. So by default, security groups are not created for subnets. So your virtual network, these subnets on your virtual network have open communication to the rest of the subnets on the network. And assuming your routes are set up on the VPN, it'll also communicate with your on-prem network. For VMs, you have the option to create network security groups, and as well as for Azure SQL Managed Instance. For the VMs, I have an asterisk there. It really is, by default, they want you to set up rules if you're putting a public IP address on that VM. If it's going to be private, by default, the setup doesn't make a push for security groups. It might still be available, but then you can go back after the fact and create those rules. Let's create an NSG on the NICs. So what does a set of rules look like? Well, this is one. This is a managed instance I have. And the first six items are Microsoft defaults, as well as the last four. So these four in the middle are ones that I created to allow communications. So I want my dev subnet to talk to the managed instance, but I don't want production subnet to talk to it. Azure Data Factory. So I've got a service tag for Data Factory that will allow communications into the subnet, as well as for Databricks, and I could also say for North Central Storage in the cloud, give me that access as well. Everything else is going to be denied. And then again, we have the default pieces from Microsoft. This one I did find, I might find over time that I've got too much access, so I can go take that rule out as things happen over time. The thing we were doing in the North Central US, we got rid of, so I went and retired this rule. So it is just click and delete, and that rule is gone. Make sure that you really want to do that, although it's not hard to add rules. If you're working with SQL managed instances, there are some outbound rules you do need to set up that Microsoft doesn't do for you. but they're going to stop you right away. And that is restoring, sending backups to blob storage. And so I need to open up TCP 443 for HTTPS traffic. That same storage account, I might have a file share for audit logs. In that case, I need to open up port 445 for SMB shares. So again, this is what a listing looks like for outbound rules. And again, so my source is the managed instance, and then my destination is wherever I happen to be going. Presh, you have a question about rules.
So
There
can I
is
just speak
not.
up if it's easier way to say it? I can. So, or do you
I'm
want to
sorry?
just take? Can I just speak up for this, or you got the question?
Yeah, I was just going to repeat your question. If there'd be any logging on attempted stoppage of communication. No, so it is like any other firewall rule. If somebody disables the rule, then it's just going to hard stop and say, I can't connect to SQL. Check your network connection. There are some assumptions that you know what's happening on the in your infrastructure. So that's communicating with the infrastructure team if people are reporting outages. So I said that there are public IP addresses available to this. When are you going to want to use them? If you have outbound traffic to external resources, perhaps, probably bad design, but you might need a linked server to a SQL instance or some other database instance that's not on your network. You need to go out over the internet to get data. Very slow, not recommended, but may be needed. Also, and this is getting better, but if you have inbound traffic from most Azure services like Azure Data Factory, Databricks, Power BI, you're going to need that public IP address. Services like Azure DevOps, if you're using pipelines, you can put an agent on your network, and so then you wouldn't need a public IP address because you'd connect through that private IP. But security warnings. If you're going to use public IP address, don't use SQL Server authentication unless you have a password that's a mile long. Configure the inbound security group rules to really lock down what can come in. And again, don't use SQL Server authentication unless you have a password this long. It's again, you're putting that SQL instance out on the internet. When on-prem, you might have it behind 2 or 3 firewalls. So, and speaking of Azure DevOps, I thought it was going to be in here and I couldn't quite remember. So here it is. We do have Azure DevOps. There is a Azure hosted pipeline agent. If you have a public IP, you'd be able to get to this. But if you have a SQL Server VM, that Azure agent can't connect to it because you're not allowing connections have that public IP address. So instead, we put that agent in our network, and now DevOps can do that. Power BI does the same thing. There's an enterprise data gateway that's been a bit around for a number of years. You can do that's how we use that Trion. Microsoft has also did though just announce, I think, that you can have a private network within Power BI of network connection. So there are some ways around that, keeping our SQL resources private to our network and not exposing them. So we're getting further along. We've got this set up. And of course, the next thing we're going to have is some network problems. So we'll just go through some common connectivity issues and do some paths for troubleshooting. So our favorite with any flavor of SQL, and we've seen this on premises how many times, can't connect to a SQL instance. Well, when we're on premises, a lot of that might be that our instance is down. If we're using managed instance or Azure SQL DB, those are generally up. You can pause them, but let's say they are up 24/7. So if our instance is up, it really is a network issue. So for managed instance, we're going to look for, is it internal or external access that we really need? If it's internal, do they have a fully qualified domain name? Yes, we know what it is. Okay, we still can't connect. Let's check the network security group rules. Well, maybe they're doing an external connection. Do they have the correct fully qualified domain name? Because here, our name is changed for the public IP. It's our managed instance.public.cluster. Or cluster name.windows.net versus just our cluster.database.windows.net. Either way, if they do have that longer name and they're connecting on port 3342, then we need to go look at the network security group rules and see what's going on. The other thing might be that, they are doing an external connection, but they had the shorter name, so we need to have them change the name. Let's cross our fingers it works, and then we'll go look at network security group rules. My slide had gotten a little out of whack. This is a lot the same for Azure SQL DB as well. If you're using Azure SQL VM, that is more like on-prem. You're going to go see, is the VM on? Is the SQL instance running? Then go check for network security group rules between the client and your servers, see where network might be blocked. The last piece for this is authentication. So authenticating to our SQL resources. And there are some differences here with our Azure resources that I do want to point out. So with Azure SQL VM, since this is a SQL Server running in a VM, we have SQL Server authentication, Windows authentication, and if we're running SQL Server 2022 with the IaaS extension, well, that'll be installed by default. We do have Entra ID authentication or Azure Active Directory available to us. So if you're migrating applications and you've been using Windows authentication with the service account, that's still available. Same with SQL Server authentication, that you can use that as well. For Azure SQL DB and managed instance, it's SQL Server and Entra, or Entra ID. Windows authentication is not available. So if that's how accounts have been going, then these two options are not, you can't migrate directly into them. You'd have to have an application change. That's just how, as Microsoft was designing that's how it came around. Going back to networking, Antonio was asking, is there any way to connect Azure DB before the database? So first, using port other than 1433, I believe for Azure SQL DB, that is a hard, that it's going to be 1433. For managed instance on a public IP, it's the 3342. Internal traffic would still be 1433. And then Azure SQL VM, you can set that port to whatever you want through the SQL Server configuration tools. So these are the topics that I wanted to share with the group today. So let's do a quick wrap up. One of the biggest things to take away from this presentation is you need to plan the migration. This isn't just a quick, let's throw this up into Azure. You need to set up that virtual network, know how you're going to connect to your on-prem network, and what all the network communications are going to be, as well as your security and what and also price point, what's going to work for you all. As part of what a lot of that, know where your limitations are in Azure or in AWS with either SQL VMs or RDS, because there are going to be some limitations in that decide where you're going to go. And then provide proper security. That it's awful tempting to just let the wizard set up public IP addresses, and always remember that public IP is internet facing. It's not just an public to your network. It's out to the world. With all that, are there any last questions?
Yeah, so Nicholas has a comment. I think it's related to Antonio's question about port, using anything other than 1433. Azure Application Proxy might do the trick. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, or you want. I mean, nobody's asking for a comment. I think it was just Nicholas trying to help out. So
sure, I have not used Azure Application Proxy, so I wouldn't be able to talk to that. It's just kind of the built-ins are what I know at this point.
Yep. Yeah, I don't see any other questions. So folks, Erin has some more time, about 15 minutes. So if you want to have any questions, comments on this presentation, you can put in the chat, and Erin will hang out. Otherwise, have a good rest of the day. And Erin, again, thank you all. I will upload this recording probably by this weekend, once I get some time over the weekend, and you can rewatch it. And then, yeah, there's some comments and very helpful. Great presentation. Joe Gavin said thank you again. Yeah.
I'm glad it helps.
Yeah, so I'll hang out for another 2-3 minutes in case, Julie says fantastic, correct level for Julie. So yeah, so I'll watch it for another 2-3 minutes before I shut it down. And if you do not have any question, comments, thank you again. And this series will continue. We have 4 more sessions coming up.
And thank you all for your time again. It's been a pleasure.
What is that link to place where you upload the video? Okay, so I'm going to put that again. Just give me a minute. It is, if you go to YouTube, just bear with me for a minute. I'm going to put that again. We also have a tiny URL for it, but I'm just going to give you the direct link. So Parlet, I put the link again. You're welcome. Okay, folks, thank you very much. Erin, thanks again. We'll see you second week of April. Have a, have a nice one, everyone. Bye.
See ya.